My name is Natalie Carter, and I still remember the sound of my father's voice cutting through that briefing room like it owned the air. I was standing at the front of a polished conference hall inside the Pentagon, about to present a system that had taken my team 3 years to build. The table was lined with uniforms, ribbons, and faces that didn't flinch easily. My laptop screen reflected the Pentagon seal, the one I had dreamed about since I was a teenager, back when I still believed my father would be proud to see me here. The moderator had just said my name when my father stood up before I could speak. He didn't even look at me. "Robert Carter, Colonel, retired," he said, extending his hand toward a 2-star general sitting near the center. I opened my mouth, ready to introduce myself, but he kept going, laughing as if we were all old friends. "Natalie's here to manage the tech," he said. "You know how these systems are? Lots of cables, lots of screens. She's the one who keeps them from crashing." The room chuckled politely. He always had a way of turning me into a footnote. My title, my clearance, my years of work reduced to a line about screens and wires. I stood there, every instinct screaming to correct him, to say something, but I didn't. I knew how this room worked. I'd spent my career watching men like him hold it together through explosions, audits, and public scrutiny. Losing composure here would only confirm what they already believed. So I smiled, nodded once, and waited for the laughter to fade. Inside, something small cracked. Not from embarrassment, but from the sharp clarity that this moment wasn't new. It was just the loudest version of what I had heard my whole life. The general turned to me with a polite, distracted smile. "Appreciate you being here, Miss Carter," he said. "We'll let your team handle the setup before the main brief." I wanted to tell him I was the one giving the main brief, that the classified clearance they'd approved was mine. Instead, I pressed my thumb against the biometric pad beside me and watched the system light up in green. No one noticed. They were too busy listening to my father talk about the old days. I wasn't angry yet. I was just taking notes. I grew up in a house where medals mattered more than report cards. My father believed the world was built on rank, salute, and a chain of command. Every wall in our home had a framed certificate or a faded photo of him standing tall in uniform. I used to think those pictures smiled back at him more warmly than I ever could. When I was 10, I tried to show him a science fair ribbon I'd won for building a working model of a jet propulsion system. He looked at it, nodded once, and said, "That's nice. But you should learn to march before you try to fly." By high school, I had stopped trying to make him proud in the way he understood. My room was filled with circuit boards, notebooks, and sketches of designs I couldn't explain to anyone. He would walk in, glance around, and joke that it looked like mission control for Barbie. My cousins were training at West Point, and every holiday dinner turned into a celebration of their ranks, their units, and their next assignments. I would mention that I got into MIT's summer robotics program, and he'd smile, say computers again, and change the subject to someone who carried a gun instead of a laptop. He wasn't cruel. That was the hard part. He thought he was being funny, guiding me toward what he called a real life. When I got my acceptance letter to MIT, he told me it was a good backup in case I didn't get into West Point. I didn't even apply to West Point, but I didn't correct him. I learned that in our house, facts mattered less than hierarchy. Even as a teenager, I knew my victories didn't fit his definition of honor. The irony was that everything I loved was connected to flight, to defense, to safety. I just wanted to build the systems that made soldiers come home alive. But to him, I wasn't part of that world. I was a spectator, a daughter playing with code instead of courage. It took years for me to understand that his blindness wasn't about me at all. It was about what he needed to believe, and maybe that's what hurt the most. These days, my office isn't in Silicon Valley or some startup loft filled with whiteboards and cold brew taps. It's deep inside a secure compound, behind doors that only open with biometric clearance. The walls are steel, the air recycled, and every conversation starts with classified. I'm the lead architect of the Athena system, an AI-driven battlefield command platform that analyzes live data, predicts enemy movement, and gives operators real-time decisions that used to take entire command centers hours to make. I don't pitch investors anymore. I brief generals. We sit around a long table in a skiff with no windows, the only light coming from the massive tactical displays lining the wall. I walk them through the system's predictive models, show them how Athena identifies threat vectors before they form, and run through combat scenarios where a 5-second warning means lives saved. They ask sharp questions. I answer them with code snippets, mission data, and live demos pulled from simulations my team built overnight. My team is small but surgical. We're made up of engineers, data scientists, and former operators who understand both the math and the mission. We work fast, often overnight, updating modules to adapt to new battlefield patterns. Athena isn't just a system. It's a force multiplier. It reduces casualties. It spots traps that human eyes miss. It doesn't replace soldiers, but it gives them a better chance of coming home. That's what we build. That's the point. Sometimes I wonder what my father would say if he could sit in on one of those meetings. If he could see the way these men, the ones he used to idolize, defer to me. If he'd understand that the battlefield isn't always where you stand with a rifle, sometimes it's the code you write that decides who walks away. But I don't dwell on it long. I have deadlines, briefs, and protocols to follow. No one in that room cares about my last name. They care about the results. They care that our systems don't crash under pressure, that our models save lives, that our work holds up under fire, both literal and political. That's the legacy I'm building. Quiet, classified, and miles beyond what he ever imagined. The room was ready. Lights dimmed, projectors humming quietly, and the Athena interface glowing softly on the screen behind me. My briefing notes were loaded. I had rehearsed this moment in my head 100 times, not because I doubted myself, but because in this room, precision meant credibility. The generals were seated. The deputy secretary had just nodded for me to begin. Then I felt him step forward. I didn't need to look. I knew the stride, the way his shoes clicked just slightly too loud on the floor, like authority announcing itself. My father moved in front of me, one hand raised in greeting to the room, the other gesturing toward me like I was the intern who'd brought the slides. "Colonel Robert Carter retired," he said, grinning widely. "Don't worry, gentlemen. My daughter's just here to keep the tech from freezing up. You know how these things go." A ripple of polite laughter passed across the table. Not because the joke was funny, but because he was speaking the language they knew. A decorated man cracking a harmless joke. The kind of moment they'd all seen at some point, maybe even delivered themselves. But to me, it wasn't harmless. It was a theft. He had stepped between me and the moment I had earned. I didn't flinch. My face held the same composed, neutral expression it always did in these briefings. But my pulse had changed. It beat sharper, steadier, like steel tightening under heat. He kept going, telling them about how Annie's always been a whiz with gadgets, and how we used to joke she could rewire the toaster before she could tie her shoes. His voice filled the room, and mine hadn't even entered yet. I waited. Not because I didn't have the words, but because I was watching. Watching the men at the table turn toward him, not me. Watching them chuckle, glance at their watches, sip from their stainless steel coffee cups like nothing unusual had happened. It was happening right in front of them, and still, they missed it. The dismissal wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. He was telling them that this wasn't my room, that I was background noise, here to support the real work. My credentials, my position, my project, all filtered through the lens of his authority. I felt the old ache rising, the one that used to come after every Thanksgiving, every, "That's nice, dear," every, "Just make sure it prints." But this time, the ache didn't settle. It sharpened. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't correct him. I let him finish his little story, nodding along like I was grateful to be in the room. I wasn't. I was cataloging every word, every glance, every assumption. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. I wasn't here to fight him. I was here to make sure no one ever confused me for a guest again. I stepped away without a word, no announcement, no explanation. Just a steady walk through the corridor toward the secure access terminal, stationed near the operations wing. My badge triggered the first gate. The master sergeant on duty glanced up, saw my clearance, and waved me through without question. Inside, the room was cold and quiet, lined with terminals that controlled access protocols for the entire facility. I logged in using my biometric scan. The system recognized me instantly. The interface came alive with a list of credentialed personnel for the Athena demonstration. My name was already there at the top. Lead architect. Full command. Below me was Sarah Lynn, my operations chief, and our security lead. Then came my father's name, Robert Carter. Retired. No clearance. I hovered over the field for just a moment. This wasn't about payback. It wasn't anger. It was a process. He wasn't on the development team. He wasn't cleared to see the Alpha Tier systems brief. According to Department of Defense regulations, any non-cleared personnel in that space required an escort. I selected the drop-down next to his name and changed the status from pending to guest. Escort required. A tiny icon popped up beside it. Non-essential. I hit save. The change locked in with a soft chime. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the screen. The act was so small. Just a keystroke. A toggle on a list most people would never see. But it marked the first time I had ever drawn a boundary with him in his language. Not a plea. Not a protest. Protocol. He taught me to respect the chain of command. Today, he would learn what it felt like to be at the bottom of it. I logged out, stood up, and walked back toward the main hall. My steps were slow, controlled. The briefing hadn't started yet. He was still talking, still shaking hands, still smiling like he owned the room. But the room had changed. It belonged to me now, and the system knew it. I walked back into the room, just as the laughter was fading. My father was still near the front, his hand resting casually on the back of a general's chair. Mid-story. I didn't look at him. I walked straight to the control terminal, placed my palm on the biometric pad, and let the system verify what none of them had bothered to ask. A soft beep, then a voice over the intercom. Access granted. Lead architect confirmed. The doors sealed with a quiet lock. The overhead lights dimmed and shifted. Projector screens came alive, lining the room with the interface my team and I had built from scratch. The name Athena, Operational Command Suite, appeared in bold white letters. Below it, in smaller font, was mine. Designed by N. Carter. Patents filed under Natalie Carter. Lead engineer. I could feel the change before anyone said a word. The stillness. The attention. The awareness that the person standing at the console wasn't there to fix wires or dim the lights. A colonel seated near the front squinted at the screen, then leaned closer to read the footer. I saw his jaw tighten. His eyes flicked to the patent list, then back to me, then to my father. My father let out a little laugh, the kind that used to carry weight. She just owns the company, he said, trying to insert himself. Hires the right people. You know how it goes. But no one answered. The room was locked. The clearance level was sealed, and I was the only one authorized to begin the presentation. I tapped a button, A&D. The first set of live simulations loaded. Satellite data flowed in. Real-time targeting models spun across the display. And then, just beneath it, a live credential log. Operator. Natalie Carter. Rank. Civilian lead. Authority level. Alpha. Class. General West leaned forward. His tone changed. You built this, he said. Not a question. A fact. Yes, sir, I replied. My voice is calm, direct. Every line of it. He looked back at my father. But this time, the look wasn't polite. It was corrective. The kind of glance you give someone who's overstayed their relevance. My father tried to smile, but his mouth didn't quite find the shape. For the first time, he was no longer the one translating my worth to the room. The room already knew, and there was nothing left for him to say. The room emptied slowly. People left in clusters, still murmuring about the demo, about Athena, about what it meant for the future of operations. A few paused to shake my hand. Others just nodded as they passed. General West gave me one last glance before he stepped out, the kind that said we'd be talking again soon, but this time behind secured doors. I stayed behind to shut down the system. The screen dimmed. The lights reset. Silence returned. I was reaching for my notes when I heard his footsteps. Measured, hesitant. I didn't turn. I waited. "Natalie," he said. His voice was lower now, missing the usual weight. That was impressive. I looked at him then. Just for a moment. He had his hands clasped in front of him. The posture of a man who had run out of ground to stand on. I offered a small, polite smile. "Thank you," I said. He opened his mouth like he might say more. An apology, maybe. A memory. Something to bring us back to safer ground. But nothing came. Just silence. It hung between us like fog, thick but harmless. I didn't offer him an exit. I didn't rescue him from the awkwardness. I let it sit there, unspoken and honest. The years he spent overlooking me, all compressed into a single beat of silence. He nodded. Not in pride, not in defeat, just in recognition. Then he stepped aside as I moved toward the secured briefing room. The door was already opening, my clearance pre-checked and logged. I paused at the threshold. "There's a classified debrief," I said, keeping my voice level. "Only project leads are cleared." He nodded again, his eyes flicking to the badge on my chest, like he finally understood what it meant. Then I walked inside. The door hissed shut behind me. The sound was soft but final. Inside, the air was colder, the lighting sharper. A table waited, surrounded by uniforms, folders marked confidential, and faces that didn't care who my father was. They cared about data, outcomes, and risk mitigation. This was my world. I didn't need to be invited anymore. I had built the room. Behind me, my father stood in the hallway. A guest. Unescorted. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Some moments aren't about revenge or forgiveness. They're about clarity. I had mine. 1 year later, I stood at the head of the same Pentagon conference room. But this time, no one mistook me for tech support. The generals knew my name before I entered. The colonels addressed me with a kind of steady deference. Even the civilian contractors, once skeptical, now leaned in when I spoke. I didn't have to prove anything. They had seen Athena in the field. They had seen what it could do. The next-gen contract was bigger, higher stakes. But I felt calm, confident. I moved through the room with purpose, fielding questions, presenting real-time data, and outlining the next phase of deployment. It was all muscle memory now. The tech, the politics, the strategy. My seat at the table wasn't up for debate anymore. It had been bolted down. After the meeting, as the room cleared again, my phone buzzed. A text from my father. I hadn't saved the number, but I knew the rhythm of his punctuation. "Natalie, Mark is transitioning out of the Army, looking for an opportunity in IT. Thought maybe you had something." Just that. Clean, direct, like a resume passed across a dinner plate. I stared at the screen for a moment, not because I was upset, not because I didn't expect it, but because it felt so distant now. A request from someone who had spent years not seeing what I built, now asking for entry. I felt no anger, no impulse to retaliate, just stillness. I locked the screen, slipped the phone back in my bag. I didn't reply. There was nothing to say. Whatever I had once needed from him had faded somewhere between the first contract and the second, between being overlooked and being handed the mission lead. I had already moved on. Later that evening, I stood in my office, the one with a clear view of the Capitol dome. I was sketching out a new framework for satellite integration. The work kept moving. The mission kept evolving. And I wasn't chasing approval anymore. I was leading. Legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you build. Line by line. Room by room. Day by day. And I had built mine.